Tec Sounds presents EduTrends.
Welcome to EduTrends, brought to you by the Institute for the Future of Education. This is a Tec Sounds podcast, the official podcast platform of Tecnológico de Monterrey. I am José Pepe Escamilla, Associate Director of the Institute for the Future of Education. Today's guest is Fernando Reimers, a Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative of the International Education Policy Master Program at Harvard University. It's a pleasure to have you here, Fernando.
Thank you so much, Pepe. The pleasure is mine.
Well, the first question I want to ask you is a personal question. So I would like to know how you ended working in education. What's the motivation behind you?
I suppose that the real reasons are, one, I had parents who valued education greatly, and I had great teachers. And I also had the opportunity early on to experience 3 different schools throughout my life. And they were very different schools. And I think that made me curious about those differences. Why were they different? And towards the end of my secondary school, of my high school in Venezuela, the country where I was born and grew up, there was a person, a politician, who wrote a book called The Revolution of Intelligence. And I was reading that book at the age of 15 or 16. The basic thesis was talent is not something that we're born with, is a result of opportunity. And I loved that book. And then a year later, the same person, his name was Luis Alberto Machado, wrote another book titled The Right to be Intelligent. And the thesis was, if talent is a result of opportunity, it is an obligation of a democratic state to create the conditions so that everybody develops their talent. And there was something about that proposition that completely grabbed me. And I basically changed my mind. Until that point, I had thought I was going to go to law school and I was going to be a lawyer. And I said, no, I actually want to do whatever it takes to advance this idea. That's how I ended up working in education. I didn't immediately go into education. I decided not to go to law school and study psychology, experimental psychology, which was, according to this author, the science that actually could teach us how to help everybody develop their talent. But I was always interested in the practical applications of the scientific knowledge about learning and teaching. And so that's how I ended up working in education. It wouldn't have happened without that little book.
That's fascinating to learn how you were. Did you decide that this process of decision of getting to education to give opportunities to everyone, and in fact, as part of the work life, the work of your life has been around that. And now I would like to ask you about the Global Education Innovation Initiative. The name sounds great. What's behind that? What are you doing? What's the objective of this initiative?
So in a nutshell, it's an effort to advance knowledge to help us support public education systems so they provide learners with the skills that allow them to become self-authoring individuals, the architects of their own lives, as well as the skills to collaborate with others in improving the many communities of which we're all a part, their local community, their state, their nation, the global community. And so and we advance that goal it's basically a collaborative of colleagues in institutions around the world. And we do 3 things. The main thing we do is applied research. We've published about 10 different books. These are comparative studies of large-scale national efforts to transform the curriculum, to transform teacher education, to create various supports, to help schools educate students holistically, develop a breadth of skills, develop what some people call 21st century skills, develop cognitive as well as social-emotional skills. So that's the bulk of what we do. But we also do 2 other things. One is we try to create various ways to engage practitioners, people who have led such transformations, into activities where they make visible what they have learned doing that. So, for example, one of our publications that has been most widely read is a book called Letters to a New Minister of Education. And it's a very simple book. I reached out to people who had led very ambitious reforms around the world and who I knew had the capacity to be reflective. And I said, would you be willing to tell the story from your point of view? What were you trying to do? What did you learn? What mistakes did you make? Where do you think you were right? What questions do you now have? And then I put together that community of mostly former secretaries of education or people who were advising secretaries in very senior roles. And then we published that little book. And in my travels, inevitably, I will meet someone who's a minister or a vice minister. Says, no, I know your name because someone gave me that book. Apparently, it's unique in its genre. It's a book for new ministers. So we do things of that sort. There are other products of that type. For example, I once convened a group of leaders of organizations of civil society that were partnering with public education systems, helping to transform them to deliver 21st century education. And we got together in a think tank to identify what are the barriers to bringing this work at scale. One of the things we have found in this enterprise is that there are many examples around the world of what I would call 21st century education, but not very many of 21st century education at real scale, national scale. And so we spent basically this think tank, this retreat, talking about what we had learned. And then we turned that into a publication. So that's the second strand of our work. I call that work making visible the knowledge that practitioners and leaders gain when they transform systems. And the third strand of our work are just very simple practical tools to help produce transformation. For example, we produce a little 7-step guide to how to orchestrate collaboration, collective leadership to improve the quality of teachers. We produce a series of curriculum resources from kindergarten to high school aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that's what we are, and that's what we do.
Thank you, Fernando. Congratulations for all the work that you're doing. So I believe that these 21st century skills, or some people call them soft skills, I also like to call them power skills because they're so important to thrive in the world, both personally but also professionally, should be the main focus of education, not only disciplinary. And many, at the level of universities, for instance, as Tec de Monterrey, we work with many other universities. If you ask whatever university you want, if they are developing these 21st century skills, they will tell you they are doing that. But when you ask them, what are you intentionally doing to develop those skills, and how are you measuring how successful you are in developing those skills, the answer is almost void. No, most of the time people think that those skills will develop somehow magically with the work that professors do in the disciplinary work. What's your point of view here?
I'm glad you're asking that question. Let me mention two things. Number one, I do think that universities are uniquely positioned, maybe better than public education systems, to experiment with how is it that we prepare people with this range of skills they're going to need to basically improve the world. And in many ways, different universities, I think around the world, we have about 20,000 universities, depending on how you count, 20 to 30,000, depending on what you call a university. And there are many experiments in that range, many different experiments to help people develop skills. And increasingly, we have observatories that can help us become aware of interesting things that are happening. So let me give you an example. One of those observatories has been put together by the Times Higher Education, this publication focused on higher education, which for many years has been producing one of the sets on one of the traditional rankings of universities, basically based on research productivity of faculty in those universities. But 8 years ago, they began to create compile an alternative set of rankings in which your university ranks very well, by the way. And that's called the impact rankings. And the impact rankings are something very simple. The Times asks I think it's about 2,500 universities that participate in the traditional rankings, would you like to tell us what you do with respect to each and every one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals? And the universities report that, and then the Times ranks universities on that. I've used those rankings as an observatory. I've done that recently for a paper that I was writing on how to educate students about climate change, which I'll be happy to tell you about. But what those rankings make visible are things like the following. One of the most, one of the most highly ranked universities in the world, number 40, is a university in India, which I would guess most people would not know about were it not for the rankings. And they're number one in impact rankings in India. The name of that university is Amrita University. It's a university, I think they're 25 years old. They have about 50,000 students, or the reverse, 50 years old, 25,000 students, largely tuition dependent, mostly a teaching university. But there is one thing that Amrita does that most other universities in India don't do. They have a requirement that all their students in all their fields spend a semester in a high poverty community, which in India means mostly a rural community, not just living there, not just observing there, but actually engage in some activity that relates to their studies. And they don't do that individually. They do that in classes with their peers, with the supervision of their professors. So this is service learning. You're all familiar with service learning. I want to come back to service learning in a moment. And as a result of that, the leaders of Amrita will tell you what we're doing is creating a different kind of leader for India, because nobody can lead a country they do not know. And our graduates know India that most graduates of Indian universities do not know. Not only do they know it in that they have spent time where people who are very disadvantaged live, they have actually learned to formulate questions and to think about problems. They have developed critical thinking. They have exercised their imagination in the context of finding solutions, working with those communities. So I think it's phenomenal that we have observatories like that that can help all of us learn from the global experience of at least 2,400 universities around the world. Of course, it may not surprise you that community-based service learning as a pedagogical approach is very effective as a way to develop a range of skills that traditional learning in a classroom, disciplinary learning, doesn't develop. Donald Shun, who used to teach at MIT, wrote this book 40 years ago, The Reflective Practitioner, in which he said one of the challenges of professional practice is that when professionals solve problems, they create knowledge. They don't just apply the knowledge that they learn in theories in the university. They actually have to create new knowledge. And it's only the best professionals who have the capacity to what he called think in action, reflect in action, and then reflect from action. And it's those two forms of reflection that can help make visible the knowledge that was gained in solving problems. And he said on universities, he was referring to the traditional university, are particularly bad at making it possible for knowledge based from practice, from solving real problems, to come back into the preparation of professionals. Now, the beauty of service learning is that it's just that. It's an opportunity to engage students who are going to be physicians, dentists, lawyers, engineers, engage them with the messiness of the real world, have them solve problems as they solve them, connect conceptual knowledge with procedural knowledge in their classes with their professors. So why am I telling you that? Simply to underscore that I think universities are already in many places, including your own, engaging in many experiments to help us develop the range of skills we need. But as you rightly said, I think we haven't sufficiently studied these experiments. We haven't sufficiently thought about the question of how do we evaluate how we're doing on these things. We haven't built a robust theoretical body that could help us advance the transformation of universities. I think that's the challenge in front of us. But I actually think that with respect to universities, there are many, many good things happening already. And your own, which the Tec of Monterrey, which I do cite in the paper I wrote on climate change. So climate change is a perfect example of one of these super complex challenges that, number one, we're not going to be able to solve exclusively from traditional disciplinary silos. And number two, universities are uniquely positioned to help solve. And by solve, what I mean is help human populations adapt to, mitigate, and perhaps revert climate change. That's more debatable, that we will be able to revert it. But at least we can slow down climate change. And so So using the information that the Times Higher Education makes available in the impact rankings, I was able to identify that your university has in its own strategic plan embedded the SDGs as a framework in the strategic plan, and you have developed something, I believe it's called the Ruta Azul, which is basically a proposal to find a way for every professional in the different careers to learn knowledge and gain skills that are appropriate to that career that connect to climate change. But maybe you can tell us more about it.
Yes. Well, yes, you're right. You know a lot of about what's happening here. And so Ruta Azul has several areas. I will categorize them in two main ones, or maybe three. One of them is generating knowledge about mitigation and prevention of climate change, which is more like disciplinary knowledge in our centers for energy, water, etc., but also transversal to the curriculum. So what are those skills? Some people call them green skills. What are those green skills that our students need to acquire now to be able to help in the mitigation of these things or the prevention of these things from happening? And then the third one is that our campus is also reduce the footprint or the carbon footprint of our campus. So we have those three branches inside the university, and we also have a report, an annual report of what we do in that area, which is very important. By the way, the Ruta Azul, which is the blue route, and I think the name is because the ocean, but also because blue is the color of the university, is playing with that. Has a special event in the conference we organize every January, the IFE conference, which is a conference on education and innovation. So we have a full section on this sustainability area in universities from these different perspectives that I just told. And I wanted also to say that you're right that these strategies like in-service learning are very efficient in developing skills, because it's very difficult to develop those skills that we were talking about, the 21st century skill, in a classroom setting. No, it's you don't do there. There are many other methodologies that can work, but the advantage of these methodologies that it forces students and faculty to connect with their needs of inclusion, let's say, of our community, which is also great. I want to go back to your global education innovation initiative findings. So if you could make a summary of the findings, or what are the good practices in the, or where maybe it's too much to ask, but where can we look?
No, it's not.
Good practice.
I'm delighted.
Developing.
I'm delighted that you're asking. I'm delighted you're asking. Let me begin with two main findings. Number one, curriculum matters. And the reason I want to say that is because there have been times when certainly international development organizations have assumed that focusing on the question of curriculum, on the goals of education systems, is a non-starter, is a blind alley. And there are publications that say that in so many words. And I think that the last 10, 15 years have been years of tremendous innovation and experimentation in reimagining the curriculum, public education systems, reimagining the standards, the curriculum, and the assessment systems that can be used to create feedback loops to produce improvement. So that's number one. And there is a lot to be learned from just looking at the range of different curricula around the world that have been attempted in their ambitions, in how they approach, for example, how they integrate what you call the soft skills transversally across the disciplines, and so on. The second finding is that curriculum is not self-executing, that designing a good curriculum doesn't transform an education system. And there are at least two things that are necessary to transform a system. Number one is a lot of attention to helping teachers develop capacities to bring that curriculum into the classroom. And that's hard to do because teachers make sense of the new words in a curriculum based on what they know. And of course, none of us knows what we don't know. And so it's very easy for people to adopt a new language, but to not change their practice. So what we have found is that the kind of professional development that helps teachers transform their practice takes a lot of intentionality, time, and money. It's difficult to do it on the cheap. In fact, one of the first studies that we conducted now 8 years ago, after our first study was a comparative study of curriculum, the second one was a comparative study of programs of teacher professional development that had demonstrated success at transforming the practice of teachers in 6 different countries around the world. And what we did were deep case studies. We spent 2 years studying those programs, and then we looked across. And when we finished, I had to write the basic synthesis of this study. I was torn as to whether we should call these teacher professional development, because what we observed was so different to most of what is called teacher professional development. See, the problem with professional development is that it's a term that is used to describe many different things, but many people think that a 2-hour workshop is teacher professional development. A weekend workshop is teacher professional development. A webinar is teacher professional development. And what we found with those programs is that they were different in the following ways. Number one, they all extended from 1 to 3 years. And they extended 1 to 3 years in deep work with not just one teacher, with the entire school. So in many ways, in fact, we debated whether we call these programs of organizational transformation, because that's what they look like, programs to change the culture of the entire school, as opposed to programs to help some individual teachers build new capacities. They had other features. They, for example, all were mobilized by some agency external to the school that built a network of schools, but that also augmented the capacity of the school by building partnerships with other entities, employers, cultural or civic organizations, community organizations, almost as if you want the schools to do something of greater ambition, of greater heft, you cannot just depend on the capacities that exist within the school. You have to augment those capacities. And one way to augment those capacities is A, to build a network of schools, B, to power that network with an engine, which is this entity. In some places, it was a university, in others, it was an NGO, and C, build partnerships that connect the school with other entities. So, for example, you create internships for the students in actual jobs, in actual companies. Internships are one of the most effective pedagogies to help students develop practical skills, 21st century skills. So these are, I could go on for much longer than we have this afternoon, but these are two of the main findings. Curriculum matters, what you intend to do, how you define the goals of education is very important. And number two, building the capacity of teachers is very important. And I want to emphasize the question of curriculum, Pepe, because we are living at a time, especially after COVID, when I increasingly hear rumblings that say maybe we should concentrate on basic literacy of students because most children don't know how to read. And of course, I think helping children learn how to read is fundamental, and it is the foundation of everything else. But I think it would be a mistake to replace the ambitions of a 21st century education with the ambitions of helping little children learn how to read. In other words, yes, if they don't learn how to read, nothing else is going to matter. But if they only learn how to read, we're not going to be able to address the challenges of poverty and inequality. We're not going to address climate change. We're not going to address the challenges of democracy. We're not going to address the challenges of violence within and between society. So I think it's important to have in education systems a combination between rich goals, ambitious goals, the kinds of goals that stretch your imagination, that force you to innovate, and then articulate those with smaller goals, modest goals, the kind of goal that you can measure, that you know how to measure, that you know how to achieve, that don't call for so much innovation, but they keep the trains running. And I think the yin and yang of transforming systems is about having both types of goals. And I have a sense that the exhaustion and the challenges of COVID have caused many people to retreat only to the little goals. And I'm not saying they are irrelevant, but I think little goals alone are not going to help us face the challenges that humanity faces.
A very interesting description of what works. And also this last one, I was almost overwhelmed by the challenges you were you were saying. Is there's a lot going on in the world right now that we need to be prepared for, and we need our children, our students to be prepared for that world. And I was thinking, as you work a lot with ministers of education and decision makers, how to balance the use of scarce resources in education to fulfill these basic needs like reading and writing, math, etc., and these more as you say, aspirational things that we need to solve, capacities to solve these big problems. What will be the way to balance the use of resources there? And I don't know how to name it, but
the way I think about these issues is I try to think of them not as either or, but both and, right? In the sense that I don't think we need to choose between teaching children to learn how to read and teaching them the skills they will need to help them transition to a green economy. I think they go hand in hand. Now, you might say, well, how can you do that? Well, you do that by thinking differently about resources. Let me give you an example of that. If you go back 5 decades, 8 decades, the main actors in public education systems in most societies were only governments. And if you go back 100 years, it was not even states, right? I mean, public education for most of the world is 150-year-old enterprise. But let's say when UNESCO was established, which is a good moment because it did transform humanity, that creation, that milestone, the main actors were public education systems. Today, that is no longer the case. One of the big innovations that has taken place over the last 80 years is the proliferation of universities, the institutional capacity, the concentration of talent that is in a university, in these 20,000 universities around the world, is unprecedented in the history of humanity. If you think about one of the great revolutions for humanity, which was the Enlightenment preceded by the Renaissance, by the Italian Renaissance. Why did the Italian Renaissance happen? It happened because a group of bankers in Florence had the brilliant idea of making Florence a place that would attract talent of mostly artists and creators. And you concentrate those creators, and wonderful things happen. People have different ideas. And they had the brilliant idea that the future of humanity didn't have to be for everybody to be born in a station in life and to essentially endure a life of misery for most people in hopes they would have a better life, that humanity could be wonderful for lots of people. So that happened in Florence, right, as a result of the work of the Medicis. When you think about the modern university, it's a Florence in every place. It's a citadel of creators. It's a citadel where people come, students and professors and staff, for the purpose of creating solutions to problems. That's why we come, for the purpose of learning. So imagine the capacity of 20,000 of those institutions around the world. Connect that to the challenges of public education system. Imagine if public education systems really had partnerships, deep partnerships with universities. Imagine what would be possible in terms of equipping students with the skills they need to understand, adapt to, and mitigate climate change. If they could do that in partnership with universities like the Tec of Monterrey or Harvard or MIT or the Universidad de Guadalajara or the Universidad de Nuevo León or any university. And I think that's the proposition in front of us. In fact, as you know, in its history, UNESCO has at 3 different pivotal times put together a commission to examine the challenges of the present and the future, and then to say, what does that mean for education? The first time it did that was in 1968, when it asked Edgar Faure to chair a commission that produced a report, Learning to Be, published in 72. Second time it did that is when it asked Jacques Delors, the former chairman of the European Commission, to chair a commission, produce a report, Learning the Treasure Within, published in 96. Third time was in 2019, when the director of UNESCO asked the president of Ethiopia to chair a commission in which I had the honor of participating. And we produced this report, for the most part, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, about the future of education. And this report is different to the previous two reports in several ways. One of them is in how it talks about the role of the university. I mean, the report basically has three sections, right? One, it says, what are the big challenges humanity confronts? Second one is what human capacities will be necessary to address that? What does that ask of educational institutions? And it says we have to reimagine the culture of education. They share ideas of what learning and teaching is. And then it says that means we need to reimagine curriculum, we need to reimagine pedagogy, we have to reimagine the teaching profession, we have to reimagine the organization of education institutions, and we have to build a continuum. This speaks to the mission of your institute. We have to build a continuum that actually supports lifelong learning. And then the fourth section of the report says, what are the catalytic actions that are going to unleash those reimaginings? And the first catalytic action is new power. What is the new power? The power of ordinary people. It says, what we need are conversations in every community, in every school, in every university about how to do that. No government has the power. No international organization has the power to decree that change. People have the power. Now, this is a very different idea to the ideas of the two previous reports that were built on the model that change comes from governments. This report, I think in part, Pepe, because we wrote it in the middle of the COVID pandemic, says people have the power. And these new technologies that we carry in our pockets, in this mobile, there is more computing power than the largest computer that existed at Harvard when I came here 41 years ago. And so
I would say my watch has more technology.
Exactly. So power of the people. Second catalytic action, universities. It says universities have not only the potential to transform themselves, they're already doing that. They have the potential to integrate themselves with the rest of the education system and to produce this education transformation. And I think some of that is happening. And you know what? Some of that is happening even in very challenging contexts. With Francisco Marmolejo, during the pandemic, we conducted a study of how 20 universities around the world had partnered with public education systems to help them innovate, to continue to educate in this very difficult period of the pandemic. And the story of that book, which was published in Spanish by the ANUIS, the National Association of Universities and Higher Education Institutes in Mexico, and published in English by Springer, is an amazing study it's an amazing story of the capacity of universities to be a force for good in society, to be a force for positive transformation, for development. So I'm actually very excited and hopeful and optimistic about this era in front of us because we have these 20,000 institutions. I would be a lot less hopeful if we didn't have universities to rely upon.
That's interesting because I was going to ask my last question before we leave. If you were optimistic or pessimistic about the future of education, I imagine the response, but I want to ask you, and why? Why are you pessimistic or optimistic?
Well, I mean, I think being optimistic when you're in the field of education, in some ways, you don't have a choice. You have to be optimistic because in this profession, you're in the business of preparing people to make the future better. And so you have to believe that making the future better is possible. It's possible. At the same time, I think it is incumbent upon any of us to exercise our capacity to build alternative future scenarios. And how do we build future scenarios? We examine trends. We examine trends in a range of areas. And of course, there is plenty to be concerned about. If you look at trends right now, you look at violence within societies and among societies, we should be concerned about that. If you look at the condition of democracy around the world, we should be concerned about the condition of democracy because in many ways it is receding, it is declining. If you look up about inequality, you see that it's very resilient inequality. And that is one of the challenges of democratic societies, these resilient inequalities, these large segments of the population that feel excluded, that feel that the social contract isn't working for them. You look at climate change and those trends, there is reason to be concerned. But then when it comes to education, you say, okay, so there are a range of scenarios that are possible, not just one scenario, a range of possible scenarios. What's going to make the difference between going one way or another? And to a great extent, what's going to make the difference are the choices that we make, that humans make. It's actually within our control as humans to choose better futures versus the more grim, the more negative, the more pessimistic futures. And that brings me to education. The capacity to make better choices is entirely contingent on how we educate people, on how we educate people, not only their critical thinking, their knowledge, but all these skills we're talking about, their self-confidence, their capacity to work with others, the capacity. Let me end as an expression of my optimism with an example from your very own state of Nuevo León. Many years ago, I was invited to a big event. I think it was organized by the Tec, to look at innovations in poverty alleviation. I was very interested in poverty at that time, remained very interested in that. And so we go there to look at innovations. And there was one innovation that I thought was incredible. It was the creation of a 20-year-old student, not in your university, but in the Universidad de Nuevo León, in the public university of your state. And what this man had done is he had created, I understand that in Mexico, there is a requirement that university students have to spend a certain number of hours in some form of social service or community engagement. And the Universidad de Nuevo León at that time had turned that requirement into a program of social entrepreneurship. And so basically the school was ready to help students engage in community programs of service learning that were solving real problems. So this 20-year-old comes to his teacher. He was a student of engineering. I forget whether it was mechanical engineering or electrical engineering. I don't know, an engineering student. He comes to his professor, his advisor, and he says, the problem I have chosen to work on is poverty. And the professor very wisely said, whose poverty and poverty when? Where? Because the only way to solve a very complicated problem is to break it into a small piece that you can wrap your head around. And so he says, why don't you find a community where there is poverty and you spend a little bit of time there and then let's come back and talk. And so the student goes to a place that is about an hour and a half away from the Universidad in the outskirts, fairly low income community. I visited that community and he comes back to his professor 2 weeks later, says, okay, now I understand the problem I want to focus on. I want to focus on the poverty of single mothers, migrant single mothers. And the professor says, tell me more. He says, well, here's the story. We have a lot of people in Monterrey who migrate from the South, from the rural South, from indigenous communities to work in the factories that exist in Monterrey. These people are young, they leave their families behind, they fall in love, and then these girls get pregnant, and sometimes the men disappear, and these girls have their babies, and they're terribly embarrassed to tell their families back home what has happened. But of course, they cannot bring the baby to the factory. At least at that time, they couldn't. And so they become completely poor. And so the professor said, okay, so now you have a target population. How are you going to solve the problem? So this kid, over the semester, with support from his classmates, from his professor, from different schools, asked a very smart question. Why do they have to go to the factories? Why can't the factories come to them? And he discovered that there is at least one product that is very easy to manufacture, and that product is liquid soap. So he created a brand. He gave it an Aztec name of liquid soap, which was soap to wash your body, a different soap to wash your dishes, and a different soap to wash your hair. And he got a small grant, $5,000, built a structure in that community. It was a big space, built a 3-month curriculum in which he taught these women how to produce liquid soap. At the end of the 3-month program, he gave them a big stainless steel container and the chemicals and the little flasks where they were going to put the soap. I went to visit that community and met with some of those women. And at the end of the program, these women were earning 1 minimum wage, which is not a lot, as you know, in Mexico. But to go from earning 0 pesos to earning a minimum wage is a rate of return greater than getting any degree at the Tec of Monterrey or at Harvard University. From 0 to 1 minimum wage is a huge return on investment in 3 months. Now, I went to see those women, and I never thought they were joyous. They were happy. They were happy about the work they were doing. And I don't think they were just happy because they were earning an income and because they could provide for their kids. They were happy in the task of working with these other women doing the soap. And as I looked at those women and talked to them, I thought, well, who is the bigger winner of this enterprise? You could say, well, the little kids who now have something to eat. You could say the women. I think the bigger winner was that 20-year-old who discovered at the age of 20 that he could take a problem like poverty and bring it to a manageable scale and make a lasting difference in the lives of, I don't know how many, 50, 100, 200 women. And all of that was possible because his university provided the context that made it possible for him to do that. So that's the basis of my hope in what universities can do, that I know things like these are happening every day in your university, in mine, in the Universidad de Nuevo León, and with 20,000 universities around the world that can do these things, there is no limit to our capacity to tackle the most complex problems that we face.
Thank you very much, Fernando, for this fascinating conversation. So I agree with you that we have to stay optimistic and we have to take a look at these possibilities, and education has more flexibility than as a problem to be solved than others. I am sure that this conversation will be also fascinating for our audience. Thanks a lot, and I see you soon.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
For more information, visit observatory.tech.mx/EduTrends podcast and ife.tech.mx. A special thanks to Tecnológico de Monterrey, the Institute for the Future of Education, and the Tec Sounds team. Tec Sounds producer, Miguel Mejia. EduTrends producers, Esteban Venegas and Cristian Higosa. Stay tuned and play Tec Sounds in your favorite podcast app for other great shows and content.